Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right, we're ready to get down. Thanks for being here today. We're super excited to have Andre Brock, who is a professor at the University of Michigan in communication studies, who's done a lot of fascinating work about race and the internet in general over the last several years. He's going to be talking about Black and Twitter. He's put together, in addition to just the hashtag Brock Twitter, he's put together this Twitter wall thing, which will be, which has disappeared, but will be appearing. And so if you have questions that you're too shy to voice, because I know we're all a bunch of, timid wallflowers, you can ask backstage and he'll get them that way. We're also going to be sort of collectively live tweeting, so those of you on Twitter, let the people know, because there was a lot of interest in Twitter and being here but not being anywhere near Boston. So we'll help the people from afar that way. You good with taking questions while you're speaking? Sorta?
Sorta.
Sorta, okay.
You calm people don't like that.
It's not about calm, it's just that I talk fast and I got a lot of complicated stuff to share with you.
Which is kind of about calm, but
It's
not
kind
in
of
the
about
disciplinary sense.
We mathematicians have no calm.
Actually, I completely agree with that.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry that some of you didn't get the teal memo. I did try to send
We decided to
it
be
out.
matchy-matchy.
The email bounced. Alrighty, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andre. Thanks.
So, this is going to be a Black Twitter presentation run by a Black person, which means I'm going to inculcate in you some principles of Black communicative discourse. In this case, that means I will say, good afternoon, and you will say, good afternoon. Very good. All right. So my name is Andre Brock. I'm a professor in communication studies at the University of Michigan, as you can see. My Twitter handle will be at the bottom of every slide in case you need it. I doubt if you will. Also, for those of you who wish to follow along, as Nancy was trying to point out before I terribly interrupted her, you can try to use the hashtag BrockTwitter, and it will show up on this website that I have listed here, brocktwitter.tweetwall.com, which will list all the stuff that is coming through from you and hopefully other participants, right? As a way of a back channel, but also as a repository for questions you might have wanted to ask while I was speeding through my slides, but didn't have a chance to, right? So, what is Twitter? It's funny. I'm sorry, I digress. So, I digress a lot. What is Twitter? Twitter is easier and harder to talk about now than when I first started studying it, back around the time when Black Twitter advanced. So you probably already have advanced knowledge of this particular social network service, but play along. I'm going to try to make this as accessible as possible. So Twitter has been promoted as everything from a from a marketing godsend to the progenitor of civil uprisings across the globe, and has seen its usage balloon from 20,000 tweets a day to nearly 500 million tweets a day as of 2015. Many of you know Twitter from the memes and hashtags that populate your feeds, while others may use it for breaking news, sporting events updates, or even random celebrity musings like Kanye versus Taylor Swift. Much of the rest of the world, however, remains confused by the service, which asks users, what are you doing now, as an impetus to talk to one another. Despite ongoing confusion, however, there must be something there, because the Library of Congress is in the process of archiving every tweet sent since the service's inception in 2006, because it considers Twitter as the internet's de facto public forum. My question is, well, I have a couple of thousand questions, but what are the cultural implications of a communications technology serving as a public forum? The first response to that question, in my mind, should be, which public? Come on up, guys. I got chairs all up front or on the side. Today, I want to discuss a specific enclave public, Black Twitter. Today's menu will roughly adhere to these topics, but given my propensity for ad libs, anecdotes, tangents, and explanatory exposition, I may jump back and forth a bit. I'll start with a brief illustration of Black Twitter and follow that with my particular approach, theoretical, methodological, and analytical, to this phenomenon. Then, returning to the topic at hand, I'll share some of my findings with you and then open the floor to hopefully a robust discussion. So, who uses Twitter? Despite its popularity, Twitter is still primarily seen as the province of geeks, celebrities, and people without sense or a life. Information researchers and popular conceptions of the internet encourage us to consider all online communication as information transfer rather than as a transmission of beliefs about the world. Moreover, social network activity like Twitter or Facebook or Snapchat is often considered banal or mundane and thus beneath notice. Twitter's microblogging platform, featuring brevity and speed, encouraged an initial perception of the service as chatter. However, more recent research and media attention have reframed Twitter as a broadcast service or a tool for social activism and political organization. 10 years after its inception, though, Twitter's reason to be is still a question for media, investors, your parents, and many of your friends. In conducting my research, I found that Black Twitter can be understood as Twitter's mediation of Black cultural discourse, or signifying. Black hashtag signifying encouraged a formulation of Black Twitter as a social public through the reveal of alternate, successful Twitter discourses to the mainstream. Accordingly, and this is according to Chris Sacca, who's one of the leading investors and an activist investor, whichever that means, in Twitter, Black Twitter is one of the best use cases of Twitter the service. He actually said Black Twitter is Twitter. Right? It's a user-driven source of culturally specific online content combining social network elements and broadcast affordances to share information to affiliated network participants. Here's my first example. Drawing inspiration from science and technology studies, this presentation asks you to consider possibilities of how this moment, where an amorphous social media service and a habitually denigrated minority culture meld to invigorate computer-mediated communication and even power a political movement. It is tempting to frame Black Twitter as a triumphal bridging of the digital divide, or as a powerful political motivator for young Blacks and minorities, but neither approach explains how or why the hashtag Thanksgiving with Black Families went viral last year. Right? So part of my reason for giving this particular talk with this particular approach is to explain why this is probably the more important uses of Black Twitter than, say, Black Lives Matter, although I'll probably get in trouble for saying that, or other political or economic manifestations. Okay? Oh, wait. Do y'all recognize any of these people? So, I realized that I might need to do some decoding for this particular thing. So last November, this particular hashtag went viral around Black Twitter, not necessarily nationally or worldwide. It did trend for a moment, though. And the thing that's going on here is that they're repurposing extant media, in this case pictures of the Obamas or the lovely Rihanna, and recasting them in ways to explain circumstances that revolve around Black cultural commonplaces or events. Right? So Thanksgiving is usually pretty generic, right? There's green bean casserole, there's turkey, there's relatives who you don't know and don't care about, and there's a football game. But Black Twitter repurposed Thanksgiving with Black Families to talk about the other things that happen when Black households get together. So he's not even family, but he made 4 plates to go. Right? This would be referred to as a side eye. Another side eye example, when you get to your auntie house, you better speak. Right? And so these are things that are perhaps common to other communities, but Black Twitter has managed to elevate the expression of Black discursive identity to an art form. So, the coining of the phrase Black Twitter is attributed, at least in my research, to Quar Sisha, who wrote at The All at the time, and wrote about late night Twitter on theall.com in October of 2009. I'm going to actually appropriate Wilson's definition. He calls it Black discourse on Twitter, not Black Twitter itself. But I find that his definition works really well. Network participation, either a tweet, reply, a retweet, or a hashtag by tightly linked affiliates. So one of the things that has been found across Black Twitter research is that Black people tend to have roughly equal follower and followee networks, right? So that way it serves almost as a SMS broadcast service as well as a social network service, right? Also, a culturally relevant topic, which is occasionally hashtagged, and propagation, viral spread to reach trending topic status, or at least viral spread so that the members of the community can participate in the back and forth. Note that this definition acknowledges but does not privilege the individual Twitter user or tweet. By acknowledging that there is a group of users, it also slides past the concept of imagined audience that characterizes early social media research. Twitter's temporal, electronic, and structural discourse mediation encourages weak tie relationships between groups through informal communication practices. However, analyzing Twitter as an information source only captures data about social use and information types, eliding cultural communicative practices. So anytime you see big data studies of Twitter, is that a hand? Come on.
You can finish your sentence.
I'm finished, go ahead.
How connected is Black Twitter to the rest of Twitter?
The same way any other user is connected. So I'm sorry, that was snark. It is.
Not how is it connected, how connected, like how, is it the same clustering coefficient and stuff, like how many neighbors? I think
Can I
that's what she's
separate?
asking.
Yeah, exactly. Can I separate Twitter into people who are in Black Twitter or friends with people in Black Twitter and a separate group of people who are roughly disconnected, or is everyone pretty integrated on Twitter?
So Freelon, McElwain, and Clark recently completed a white paper where they did a study to see what types of groups make up Black Twitter. And it's not necessarily a separate, like I had the Venn diagram earlier, it's not necessarily a separation of, it's actually the content that pulls them together to allow us to identify them, allow me to identify them as a group. So they're not separate from Twitter at all, right? But what they are, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more, they are extraordinarily successful at utilizing the medium in ways that highlight their participation, right? And this is interesting and different from other social network services, which don't necessarily broadcast what people are doing to the entire network, right? If you look at your Facebook feed is consists of who you follow and perhaps sometimes who follows you and the random stalkers who are paying attention, right? But it doesn't tell you everybody who's on the network. If you looked at what used to be known as a Twitter fire hose, the Twitter public timeline, which used to be accessible and is not, you would see every tweet, including all the Black Twitter ones, as soon as they were published, right? And Black Twitter allows for a certain topical and cultural coherence in understanding the activities of a particular group of Twitter users. How's that?
Great.
Now, I don't have the mathematical or the quantitative skills to tell you how that exactly works, but we can talk. How's that? Okay. Let's try again. Let's continue. So it's clear that Black Twitter is encoded and wait, there was another hand. No? Okay. It's clear that Black Twitter is encoded and digital. These are not instances of inappropriate or illiterate tech usage. So how then to understand how culture shapes technology use? My research stream originated in digital divide research. Black Twitter is of interest for communication and new media studies, communication studies and new media research because of the ways in which American racial ideology has employed media, culture, and information to symbolize, segregate, and discriminate against Black Americans. It's of interest to me because Black culture persists despite the stresses of living in a racial regime and expressing humanity, joy, sensuality, and cultural critique through various media and information. As the internet has become part of our communicative infrastructure, everyday life has become Oh. What happened? As the internet has become part of our communicative infrastructure, everyday life has become inextricably intertwined with internet usage thanks to the popularity of social media. Although digital divide research encourages the perception that minorities remain on the wrong side of the divide, in 2009, researchers and the media discovered that Twitter participation by African Americans actually dominated usage of the then growing social media service. And this discovery went against then popular perceptions of white people as default internet users. looking further forward, Pew Internet published survey findings recently, as of 2015, to find that 23% of all Internet users surveyed use Twitter. The demographic distribution breaks down to 28% Black, 28% Latina, and 20% white. Right? Just because I'm interested in this kind of stuff, so now you are too. Other minority-led social media services include Instagram, which is 31% female, 24% male, and 47% Black, 38% Latina, and 21% white. Also 55%.
Wait, 30% male and 24% female, and what are the rest?
47 Black. So we go from gender to race. 47% Black, 38% Latina, and 21% white. And then let me add another one because I love math. 55% of users are between 18 and 29. So it skews young, it skews minority. Another one that's of interest that is not talked about nearly enough is Tumblr, where not as many people use it, but in terms of demographics, Blacks are 15%, Latina 15%, and whites at 9%. So there are other minority-led social media services, minority-dominated social media services, but for today we'll just talk about Twitter. So my particular research approach, cultural informatics, examines cultural biases encoded within information and communication technologies and pairs them with insights into the technological biases expressed through the culture of the users. From this perspective, I believe that cultural motivations can be apprehended as functional rationales for technology use. And let me say that in clearer language. So one of my favorite examples for my undergrads, my favorite example is not theirs, as we talk about the differences in the type of technology used. So people with Windows laptops and Android phones are considered professionals. People with Apple laptops and Apple phones are considered
Consumers?
yeah. Creatives. Anyone else is not pandering? So my class, my undergrads usually call them sheep, right? Or hipsters, right? The perception is that if you use Apple, you're not necessarily using it because it's sophisticated technology that happens to work 90% of the time without the blue screen of death or a forced upgrade to Windows 10. Instead, they assume that you're using it because you're more obsessed with style and aesthetics than you are with actual computational power, right? So the beliefs of the technology users go into explaining why certain people use certain things, or at least the perception of, right? This diagram illustrates my research approach to information and communication technology use. My home discipline is information science, and more specifically social informatics. And social informatics examines the computational, institutional, and social concerns encountered by organizations when they introduce information technologies to their practice. Cultural informatics is the interpretive critical strand of SI. A cultural informatics approach expands the inquiry to cultural factors affecting computerization and use, such as race, ethnicity, gender, or sexuality. So this diagram illustrates a cultural informatics approach. All technologies have three components: the material artifact, which includes virtual and digital aspects, the practices necessary to use the artifact, which include organizations, rule-making bodies, and users, and the beliefs of the technology's users and non-users. To use another terrible example, the idea that when you have a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail. Oh, good, that one worked. I like that one. So Arnold Pacey, who I totally stole this from, argued that public and academic understandings of technology are limited to descriptions of form and function, right, rendering the ideological aspects of invisible. But because humans are technology users, however, we often represent ourselves through our affinity with and domestication of a given tool. These positions reflect our beliefs about certain uses and uses of technology. So I contend that the cultural and social beliefs of technology users play a significant part in the design, adoption, dissemination, and use of any tech. Can I talk smack about Windows phones while I'm here? No.
They're almost dead.
Exactly, right? But I won't. I will refrain. These can range from...
It's okay. Satya told us that, use an iPhone, use an Android, it's just fine. We can help vary.
If Satya says it, I must agree. So the cultural and social beliefs play part part in unconscious design decisions based on physical traits, such as right hand dominance, such as hand size. So my tablet that my iPhone 6s Plus, which I have to have a strap on so that I can actually move my thumb from top to bottom, right? Or even to deeply held cultural associations between race and intelligence. This conglomeration of things is, come on slide, technoculture, there you go. All right.
Is that an Apple laptop?
It is, but it's on a Windows network. So do what I can. Across my research stream, I contend that information technologies are not only material objects, but also incorporate social practices and beliefs about the control of the natural world and configurations of our social behavior. Although new technologies are deployed to serve a particular need, they often reinforce existing social patterns and create new social practices far beyond the designer's original conception. For this presentation, I ask you to consider the internet, in its guise as Twitter, as a computational and informational technology designed to transmit cultural beliefs, practices, and ideologies, as opposed to the simple, rational, productive communication of information. Right. Accordingly, we can then see that information and communication technologies not only require functional literacies, but cultural ones as well. Which culture? Joel Bienerstein, writing in 2006, argued that technology is the American theology. And Siva Vaidyanathan doubled down on that by phrasing America's fascination with technology as techno-fundamentalism. Bienerstein goes so far as to argue that technology as an abstract concept functions as a white mythology, structuring American identity constructed through an assumed superiority over societies that are static, primitive, passive, communist, terrorist, or fundamentalist. Right? I'm not arguing that other cultures do not value positivism and rationality, but since science displaced superstition and religion in Western Europe, however, positivism, empiricism, and imperialism form part of this matrix of Western technoculture. And the remaining qualities are masculinity, religion, progress, the future, and whiteness. Information and communication technologies promote control over space, over time, and textual literacy, and predispose us to think of the world in terms of information. Moreover, given ICT's academic, governmental, and mercantile origins, they also emphasize efficiency, surveillance, and hierarchy. White participation in online activities is rarely understood as constitutive of white identity, even with sites like Stuff White People Do. Instead, we are encouraged to understand their online activities as stuff people do, right? So then what would a critical culture vision of ICT usage look like? Or, and this is a question for the end, is there such a thing as white Twitter? Save that answer for later. So one of the difficulties in doing racial research in new media, particularly when I started 10 years ago, is that at the time when I started, nobody really believed black people were online, so they always asked me whether or not I knew the people who were black were actually black. Which is a tough kind of question to ask, considering at the time you really had no access to phenotype, voice patterns, clothing styles, or the like. And so I turned to this definition of racial identity. It's actually ethnic identity, but I put racial because that's where I am. Come on back. There we go. And to take on this discursive definition, that racial identity can be understood as the practices and beliefs that the in-group and out-group agree can be attributed to the in-group. Right? So it means that no ethnic or racial group exists in isolation. Their contact with other cultures does as much to define them as their own internal practices do. Right? This works really well for the internet, right? Because since I don't have phenotype and I can't trust pictures because of Photoshop, and or YouTube videos, then I can use what people say about themselves as a proxy for understanding what their racial identity is. So Black Twitter does not represent the entirety of black online presence, nor do the multitude of racist and racialized responses to the phenomenon comprise the entirety of the racial matrix within which Black Twitter is understood. So that kind of answers your question from before, young lady. My argument for Black Twitter is it's as much as what people say as what people say about it. Does that make sense? So whiteness is technoculture. American identity is bounded and extended by negative stereotypes of black identity. right? However, cultural traits are group attributes. The group is not the synthesis of its traits. Henry Giroux notes that whiteness represents itself as the universal marker for being civilized, and in doing so posits the other within the language of pathology, fear, madness, and degeneration, to which I would also add technical illiteracy. Right? Black Twitter confounds all of these ingrained perceptions, plus the ones about online identity, by making apparent through external observation and internal interaction how culture shapes digital practice. So to get to Blackness and Technoculture, I turned to W.E.B. Du Bois, which is, again, another discursive definition. And Du Bois' formulation of double consciousness, I'm not going to read it because I know you've read it before, acknowledges the hegemony of whiteness without privileging it over the agency and spiritual energy found within the black community. Callie Tao wrote that, ironically, African American critical theory provides very sophisticated tools for the analysis of cyberculture, since African American critics have been discussing the problem of multiple identities, fragmented personae, and liminality for more than 100 years. The struggle of African Americans is precisely the struggle to integrate identity and multiplicity, a perfect model of the postmodern condition. Right? And that particular quote applies very well to understanding how people represent themselves on Twitter and other social media services, because I think it's fair to say that many of you do not represent yourself fully on any one social media service. You have different ones for different affiliate groups and your parents and your employers, right? And so that liminality, right, the switching between, but also the multiplicity is something that black people have been talking about from jump. So next we go on to interface discourses. This is the fun analytic part of the presentation. If you feel like falling asleep, please, I won't mind. Twitter is artifact. For those unfamiliar with or interested in Twitter, it's a social network premised on connecting people through subscription-based broadcast content. The communication is simultaneously public and circumscribed, but can also be limited to private networks as well. The social mechanism is follower/followee. One can choose to follow or subscribe to people whose tweets they wish to receive, and in turn can be followed by those who wish to receive their broadcast. When the tweet is published to one's followers, it is also published in chronological order on the public timeline. Taken in its raw form, the public timeline is a fountain, a veritable cornucopia of minute bits of information at immense speed, mundane and personal, important and official, but it is nearly incomprehensible because of that speed. Despite this immense volume of information, however, Twitter functions as a social network because the loosely connected groups of followers and followed provide context to their messages through their shared interests and culture. So when you become an egg, everybody familiar with the egg status of Twitter, right? It's hard to figure out what you like about Twitter. Twitter will suggest to you that you can add your contacts, which then provides you some topical context and content because your friends presumably share the same interests as you. It also suggests information sources such as popular tech magazines or media stations or even celebrities. Right? So Twitter does a lot of work to get you to understand that the best way to enjoy Twitter is to follow people with whom you share an interest. That make sense? The most heavily cited research on Twitter primarily focuses on Twitter's communicative capacity. This particular research looks at Twitter's discursive affordances, and I'll talk about affordances in a minute. As a social network, Twitter has a very minimal interface, a svelte interface, when compared to Black Planet. Anybody familiar with Black Planet? Don't worry about it, I'll tell you about it later. Or Facebook. Anybody familiar with Facebook? Okay. Where Facebook features a plethora of widgets, ads, photo galleries, additional pages, applications, and information you don't care about, Twitter's current primary interface is still a 2-column page with a standing header. It also has tabs across the top for additional navigation, but it's still primarily the 2-column header. The web interface is simple in part because of the designer's limitation of Twitter content to 140 characters per message. Because of this limitation, Twitter also works as a short messaging service, which is how it started, right? And on instant messaging services such as chat rooms. The material affordances necessary to use Twitter as an SMS service, an internet-connected client with a screen and an input device, I believe were intentionally nerfed by, does everybody know nerfed? Intentionally reduced in difficulty by Twitter's designers in order to reach the widest possible number of ICT configurations. Right? Any internet-enabled device with a screen that has access to a texting plan or the internet can access Twitter. For a minute, Facebook was struggling to catch up with Twitter because Facebook had a crap mobile interface. I don't know if you remember that from back in the day, 2 or 3 years ago. Twitter has always been native in many ways to the various devices. At one point, when I first did this research, looking at the number of Twitter clients, there were 300 third-party Twitter clients plus the Twitter web service itself. Right? That number has since declined because Twitter has done some consolidation and kicked people to the curb. Right? But just think of the multiplicity of devices that people can use that fit in with their individual circumstances. Back to that SMS thing, which is available on your mobile phone, my other argument is that Twitter's message format lends itself neatly to mobile adoption. This is significant for a couple of reasons. First, your mobile phone serves as your genius loci for our social milieu. In other words, it knows everything about you and the people you associate with. Right? Your friends, family, and acquaintances, and your media about them are all stored and easily accessible through a pocket-sized, sophisticated, internet-enabled information terminal. Right? Moreover, recent research found that black people are 70% more likely to access the web through a mobile device on a typical day than whites. Also, more math, nearly half of all mobile users access Twitter from their phone. Right? Even today, I think the Twitter website is 50%, and the other 49% is 100,000 other clients and operating systems. Right? And 1 in 10 blacks access Twitter on a typical day. So taken all together, you look at a group of people who tend to primarily access the internet through a mobile device where Twitter is native, that 1 in 10 black people, a population of 39 million, 10% of those people access Twitter on a typical day, right? And I'm assuming there are some who over access, but I'm not one of those people, right? But it leads to an understanding that people who have already had an accommodation with having a mobile device in physical proximity that allows them to contact their friends and family, thus take to a mobile service that is present on this device that allows them to contact friends and family. One of Twitter's unique features is that the service incorporated user-generated discourse conventions, such as the retweet and the hashtag, as formal mechanics. This is not like the Facebook fiasco where they slammed the news feed on you and you complained about it for about 10 minutes and then said, the news feed. Right. It is the hashtag that I'll pay the most attention to today that is often symbolized as the standard of Black Twitter discourse. I promised I'm going to talk about affordances. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, Norman's definition for graphical interface design affordances is on this side. And Norman says that an affordance is an action that is afforded by design that the user perceives to be possible through convention, word, or metaphor. And this would be the point where I get to complain about the doors on the 12th floor and other floors in this building that have a handle when you leave the area, a handle facing towards you, and a sign that says pull on it. And most of us, when we reach for the handle, tend to push. Right? So it's an affordance that is not really well considered by the designer. There's it confuses the ways in which our body mechanics work, our normal understandings of how to progress through a door, and the words that are put up on the screen on the door itself. Right? Twitter also has affordances. The first, mobility, actually derives from the physical properties of the devices on which many users access the service, but becomes significant because of the untethering of computer use from home or office and the desegregation of computer access. So in the early stages of digital divide research, one of the primary problems was they figured people didn't use the internet because they couldn't afford the subscription or they couldn't afford the device. Then they didn't use the internet because they didn't have the technical literacy necessary to use the internet's applications and features. Then they said that people couldn't use the internet because they didn't have broadband access. Right? The mobile phone overcomes all of those things, right? You have many people have a mobile phone. I think they're up to 262 million in the United States alone, right? Many people know how to use their mobile phone. A baby can operate an iPad, so I'm including iPads and mobile devices, right? And they're usually internet connected, right? So this allows for a desegregation. Suddenly, it's a device and a technology that is accessible to thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of people, right? But also it also separates us from the environments in which we normally did our computing. So I'm old enough to remember using computer terminals in my computer lab when I did my undergrad, right? There was no taking that computer home to then later play games. If you play games in that lab. Right? If you flirted using Usenet in that lab. What? Don't act like y'all didn't flirt, right? Similarly, when computers moved to the home, a lot of times people, before laptops became popular, there was a computer room. Remember that? Right? If you were lucky, you had a computer in your room, right? But then your parents started getting suspect because they're like, what are you doing on that computer? You have some kind of stalker, right? The cell phone, again, takes us out of those spheres, those environmental spheres of computer use, and allows you to use it in spaces where it was once considered impolite to use them. So on the bus, at dinner, right? When you're visiting your in-laws. Oh wait, that's me. Right, and so it adds a layer of information access and social access to interactions everywhere, as opposed to the specific limitations that computerization had before, right? And I talked about that way too much, but that's okay. Mobility also references bodily proximity. One of the phrases that I heard a lot when I was much younger was "hit me on the hip." Is anybody familiar with that phrase? And only the brown people, not even the brown people. All right. So I don't know if you know this, but when rap was first getting started in the gangster era, lots of people had pagers. Remember pagers? Yeah. Right. And because at the time, public payphones were dwindling. Both the government deregulated the services and the telcos began disinvesting in them. The best way to catch up with people who didn't have a phone at home or have public access was to page them. The pager resided on your hip. Does that make sense? Right. So now, instead of having a computational device that's tied to a particular location and a particular identity, now you are your mobile device, which has its negative implications for work. I heard that you're supposed to answer email from your bosses as soon as you get them. But I say that I have a mobile phone that doesn't have good connectivity, and see how that goes. Okay. Sociality, these next two are interface specific. Sociality is slightly different for Twitter. All social media apps now ask for access to your contacts, but Twitter simultaneously publishes content to the entire network and your designated followers. At one point, this was significant because all of Twitter was public. Like when you went to the Twitter website, you didn't even have to log in. It just showed you everything that was going on, right? But still, the publicness is still in play because the Library of Congress is recording everything that's sent. So this visibility changes the ways in which people perform themselves on Twitter. Although I would argue for Black Twitter, most of them don't care. But also because the sociality incorporates your follower-followee network, you have a sense of intimacy, in part because these are people that came out of your phone. That sounds really bad. These are people that were resident on your phone, right? So you know them already. You have shared topics. You will tweet about them to topics that y'all have in common, right? So you will treat it as a circumscribed public, personal social network as well. The last one is brevity. Brevity affords multiple possibilities. I would like you to think of, say, the haiku. Please, not the sonnet. We can't do sonnets. Or the limerick, right? The brevity affords multiple possibilities, a ruthlessly enforced, ritualized communicative format that favors dramatic and cathartic content over rational, unemotional content. Have you ever heard a rational limerick? Have you ever enjoyed a rational limerick? It just doesn't work. From a computer-mediated communication perspective, these affordances are formative but not strongly deterministic. There are countless permutations of information that can be actualized within these limitations. Taken together, these three affordances provide a set of conditions that map well onto Black discursive identity, which I will now talk about. All right. One way that Black discourse articulates personhood is through signifying. All Black people do not signify. All Black people don't speak Ebonics. All signifying is not Ebonics. Right? I feel like I need to make that clear. Right? Signifying draws upon... What is Ebonics? African American Vernacular English. My favorite example is the ways in which my relatives add the plural S to stores and other institutions that are singular. So Aldo, which sells shoes, becomes Aldo's. Kroger, which sells food, becomes Kroger's. However, if you have diabetes, which is already plural, it becomes the sugar. right? These are commonplaces. These are discourse conventions which some linguists argue draw from West African speech patterns and have been reproduced or preserved in the ways in which black people and Southerners, to a certain extent, talk in the United States today, right? So signifying draws from Ferdinand de Saussure's sign, signifier, signified formulation. And I'll remind you, because I know your linguistics class was a long time ago, the sign is a thought model or concept. The signifier is interpreted as the material form, something which can be seen, heard, touched, smelled, or tasted. And the signified is the mental concept. Right? So the sign is composed of the signifier and the signified. If I say chair, you see this chair, you might be assuming I'm talking about this chair, but I'm actually talking about my beanbag chair in my office, which is super comfortable and naps so well. It lends itself to nap so well. I miss that chair so much. Sorry. For black culture, signifying discourse purposefully rearranges things. The signifier becomes the interlocutor, the playful interlocutor, while evolving the signifier's form to a signified upon object. And I'll explain that in a minute. From this perspective, signifying is both thematic matter and rhetorical strategy for interlocutor and audience, because when engaged in signifying discourse, the hearer, the audience, has to attend to all potential meaning carrying symbolic systems and speech events, decoding them through their from their background knowledge in black culture. In slightly less complicated terms, discourse involving the recognition and attribution of some implicit meaning or connotation that is potentially obscured by the denotation, the surface, content, function, or context. So signifying, performed as an inventive redefinition of an object or action using cultural commonplaces and philosophy, can be considered as an articulation of a shared worldview or recognition of the forms, plus participation in the world play, signals membership in the black community. Black discourse, from this perspective, moves from rational, efficient information transmission and instead becomes a reflexive, affective commentary on everyday life and the negotiation of American racial ideology. That it also happens to be funny is the icing on the cake. One of my colleagues is here, and she did a really great paper on a hashtag that was called Paula's Best Dishes. Only some of you laughing. The tag refers to Paula Deen, right? Paula Deen had an incident where apparently she used words that she shouldn't have used to refer to her black staff. And so Black Twitter took it upon itself to reframe Paula's recipes in ways that refer to both her use of pejorative language for black people and her culinary skills. That's the most complicated explanation of Paula's Best Dishes ever. All right. The tweet fits into discursive identity. And I love this quote because this quote is from 1972, right? But to me, it describes how Black Twitter works so well. The individual as stylist operates on a plane, or more accurately, of a sphere of interest, defined from the white point of view as entertainment, and more profitably from the black or theoretical point of view as ritual drama or dialectical catharsis. So the tweeted signifier can be seen as representing communicative conventions, message, which is presence, social affiliation, which is audience, and an often metaphorical subject, tightly constrained by format and kairos. Now to the hashtag. I'm assuming you know what hashtags are. It's an octothorpe. I was going to put hashtag up there, but I figured that wouldn't really make any sense. But let me distinguish the hashtag from a trending topic. And I have the definition up here. It was initially deployed on Twitter by Chris Messina in 2007. It has now taken on a separate life and is used across a number of different social media websites to demonstrate some sort of affective CMC discourse convention like emoji. Right? You can always tell when people don't know how to use hashtags because they'll have 17 of them in the message, particularly on Instagram or Facebook, and you're like, I don't care about your hashtag life, right? Hashtags work best when they're concise and they're specific, right? Twitter's enormous volume of tweets effectively obscures the activities of groups of users, right? Hashtags and trending topics filter Twitter in a way that not only identifies topics of interest, but who generates those topics. The hashtag is a folksonomic device. Folksonomic meaning user-generated way to organize a taxonomy. Right? And it's often articulated a priori. Well, at the time it was. Now people put hashtags anywhere in the tweet. But it was generated before at the beginning of the tweet, so people knew what was going on, right? What they should respond to, how they should respond. And so it works to situate the message within a wider, near real-time conversation. Right? Trending topics, on the other hand, are designed to surface Twitter topics that are enjoying a surge in popularity. Surge is the operative word. So the Beliebers, the Gamergaters, the Barbs, the Beehive, the Little Monsters, they rarely trend unless something happens to piss them off, right? Because they have this constant high level of Twitter activity. The trending topic algorithm looks for spikes by tightly constrained groups of people that manage to achieve a certain level of popularity and then get picked up by other groups to make it go viral, right? What makes Black Twitter remarkable is that it is often able to crack trending topics despite posting content that is primarily of interest to the internal community. Last piece about hashtags. Going back to the signifying part, the hashtag serves triple duty. It's the signifier, the sign, and the signified. It marks the cultural concept to be signified upon, the cultural context within which the tweet or content should be understood, and the call awaiting a response. That last part is important. Those familiar with Black and Southern religious culture are familiar with the signifying practice of call and response, where the minister incorporates his audience into the speech by either requesting a specific response or by eliciting extemporaneous responses by appeals to cultural commonplaces. So, yes?
I keep on cutting you off.
I don't care. I got plenty of time.
Do you have a sense of which users are generating the hashtags that end up defining Black Twitter?
Say it again?
Do you have a sense of which users are generating the hashtags that end up defining Black Twitter? So is it more like Rihanna, or is it the normal users?
I'm pretty sure Rihanna never does. The thing is, it's about invention, right? And so it's more about who is able to best playfully discuss a topic in a way that seems tangential to it, yet related to it. Does that make sense? So, like I talked about Rihanna's side-eye earlier, right? If you think of signifying as a side-eye, you are looking at a particular object, but in a way that indicates that you are, one, distant from it, and two, disapproving of it, right? Signifying does a lot of that, right? So yes, Rihanna will start a hashtag, but it won't necessarily be a Black Twitter hashtag, in part because Rihanna's a huge pop star. Now, if you'd have said Mary J. Blige, I would argue Mary J. Blige would be, I'm sorry, let me try again. If you would say, Aisha Curry. No NBA players? I think it's something, right? At this point, then I have to go to Black Lives Matter stuff. So if they gun me down, hands up, don't shoot, right? Those types of topics that are necessarily not generated by a power user, but by somebody who generates something that is immediately emotionally affecting and effective to large groups of users and then gets picked up. Does that make sense?
Becky with the bad grades would be a good hashtag.
Nobody remembers Abby Fisher, not even the Supreme Court. Hashtag then becomes a call for Black Twitter participants to recognize performance and respond in kind. Right? So think of how hard it is for your hashtag to go viral if nobody retweets it. Right? They are often disengaged from explicit or direct information provision, instead instigating on the play and chain of signifiers, Becky with the bad grades, right, to structure interaction. While hashtags can and do perform political work and critique, many more are deployed to celebrate Black life, which was Thanksgiving with Black families. Hashtags led to the discovery of Black Twitter through their domination of the trending topic algorithms. They also contribute to a formulation of Black Twitter as a public. Right? Going back to my definition of a racial group, they work as a window to allow outsiders to view insider discourses, right? But these discourses were and still are unconcerned with the mainstream gaze. Right? So it's a public, what we would call an enclave public, someone that's part of a larger group of participants, but has its own concerns that structure the types of things that are of importance to it. 21 of 25. Fake tweet example. This hashtag, New TV One Shows, sets the grounds for discussion. TV One is a Black-owned television network that I'm sure most of you have never seen. And this particular hashtag, at the time, TV One was trying to figure out what type of programming it would generate. And so they were suggesting that they could come up, Black Twitter was suggesting that they could come up with better New TV One shows than TV One itself. This then allows for the invention of possible cultural concepts that fit within this hashtag. For instance, a TV show called Black Folks Don't Eat No Pumpkin Pie. Now, this is a reference to Black food culture, a preference for sweet potato over pumpkin pie, right? The response to the hashtag's call and the signifying yields the response, we don't, no, in all caps. Right? So this is a multiple engagement with a hashtag and a signifying topic by a couple of different people. Right? The hashtag sets the rules of the engagement, basically. Your knowledge of signifying commonplaces and practices helps continue your participation. And the fact that somebody else picked it up and responded to it means that it's in play as signifying discourse. New TV One shows did not trend for long. I think it did 45 minutes at most. Right? It was, I think my data set for New TV One shows is about 375 tweets. Right? Which in 2010, when I collected it, that's a lot of tweets. That's big data. All right. Discussion. Well, my discussion, not yours. Black discursive culture specifically signifies focus on invention, delivery, ritual, and audience participation, maps well onto Twitter's function of rapid communication between groups of connected users. Black Twitter illustrates Twitter's capacity as a cultural, online communicative medium by transcending the size limitations and conversation incoherence of chat rooms. I don't know if you remember the Java chat rooms where somebody could completely disrupt the entire discourse by posting huge emoji and sending the message scrolling up off screen. Yeah, I see you do remember because you were probably those people. By adding a temporal imperative that chat rooms also had, keep up or be lost, to the asynchronous, chronologically ordered discussions of email and bulletin boards, while allowing users to participate in open-ended community-building discourses in near real time. Right? So these are some of the characteristics of Twitter as black discourse. It is performative, meaning it's discourse in a virtual space by an individual and a group as condition of network participation. It's also signifying performance, which means you have to have verbal dexterity, cleverness, and communicative competence, which also serves as a marker of black identity. It's also ritualistic. Ritual, in this particular case, afforded by the limitations of the Twitter format, 140 characters, including attribution, although now links and is it hashtag? No, images don't count towards your Twitter length anymore, your tweet length, right? But it's still format. It's still a fairly rigid format. Tweet length, delivery, temporality, format, and setting conventions. So I'm one of those people who always thinks of a good comeback 24 hours after something happened to me, which makes me a terrible black Twitter person, right? Black Twitter depends on that rapid response and interaction. That's part of the verbal skills and dexterity that makes those things go viral in a particular time, right? Multivalent. Oh wait. There are ritualistic conventions of signifying discourse. It's multivalent, meaning there are multiple meanings available to any particular utterance. There's metaphor, there's delivery, there's kairos, as I just mentioned, style, and call and response. Pathos is legible content. This is the one where I think y'all are going to argue with me, but we'll see. I talk real fast. You might miss this part, right? I argue that because of brevity and going back to haikus and limericks, drama, humor, and catharsis are fit perfectly for message format and comprehension. Nobody wants to read a Twitter dissertation line by line. Like, there are people who publish entire books as tweets. Nobody reads that. That's just you being a whatever, right? The format and comprehension that are afforded by length, temporality, and audience, right? There's also the pathos that comes from signifying topoi, misdirection, indirection, invention, connotation, and critique, right? Now, usually when I talk about signifying, the first reference that people make to it, for those who are familiar, is the dozens. Everybody heard of the dozens? Or snaps, right? The dozens is yo mama jokes. Your mama's so fat, your mama's so black, blah, right? Notice that anytime you have to use more words than necessary, your joke about somebody's mama or your snap falls flat. That maps well onto the way Twitter structures discourse as well. Does that make sense? Let's see. So the last part is encoded and decoded for individual, topical, network, and algorithmic comprehension. Right, which brings back in the computer-mediated communication aspect, but also the signifying aspect. The use of cultural commonplaces, particularly hashtags, provides topical coherence and coerces social participation. Also, the hashtag participation coerces algorithmic interest to generate trending topics. Right, and in signifying for encoding and decoding, cultural commonplace between network members marks cultural membership. So, we're at the end. To conclude, I carefully crafted this presentation to avoid blacksplaining Black Twitter by using comical or ratchet tweets. I could have. I chose not to. I also consciously admitted the vast majority of uncivil reactions to Black Twitter usage because my own political agenda is to highlight the agency of Black technology users, which is a much more delicate and subtle undertaking that refuses deficit models of Black technology usage. I will say, though, that Twitter violates the rationalist, capitalist, and efficiency mores of Western technoculture, and thus was ripe for colonization by Black discourse. Chris Sacca has said that Black Twitter is Twitter, which I agree with. Black Twitter came to online prominence through creative use of Twitter's hashtag function and subsequent dominance of Twitter's trending topics, but I tread carefully here because Black folk have been Twitter users since 2007 when the service went public. 2008, I think I'm number 4,000 as a Twitter user, right? Like other Black activities, Black Twitter would have been nearly invisible, understudied, and niche without the intervention of the hashtag. Typically, social networks gain popularity and public notice as users encourage their friends or friend networks to join. Black Twitter, like the honey badger, just want to be sure we still remember the honey badger, okay, doesn't care about its popularity. Twitter happens to be one publicly accessible place where this type of discourse occurs online. In fact, as more Blacks adopt Twitter and trending topics are adjusted to discount their participation, something which has already happened, Black Twitter will return to the audience most involved, Black folk. Finally, all Twitter use is cultural, even the bots. Oh, Tay. Can we talk about Tay? Tay. Oh. And it's up to new media and internet researchers to move beyond functional or normative analyses of computer-mediated communication to find underlying cultural rationales. So there's a reason why Tay went racist, right? And it's in part due to the cultural associations of her designers and the cultural associations of the audience that they exposed her to, right? For every internet-enabled or digital phenomenon, it is driven by cultural influence. My method and approach is directed towards Black online identity and digital practice, but could also have been used to ascertain other cultural influences on digital practice as well. Boom. So I asked Dr. Daniel Green, I love saying Dr. Dan, to monitor the Twitter stream. Are there anything that came up of interest as a question?
Yeah, two people actually asked some version of this is
Harpo, who these people?
a wonderful talk, and I'm echoing what they said, but also a wonderful talk. But it seems very focused on Black Twitter as logically African American experience feed into this platform. So how does Black Twitter as a platform, as a community, as a conversation about a conversation, work with the Black diaspora outside of the U.S.?
It's a good question. So I have to be careful, especially because Tarleton's not here. I won't call it a platform. It works in part because one of the shared concepts for the Black diaspora is experience with imperialism, colonialism, and former activities, right? And so many of them can bond over those particular instances of shared history. Other ways, it happens in other ways too. So I follow natural communities, natural hair communities that also have sprung up in Brazil and South Africa, right? And ways in which people understand the Black aesthetic to be encapsulated by the use of hairstyles for both professional and personal aesthetics, right? That is a Black Twitter community as well. I think that sort of answered your question, but kind of not really.
Any so those are similarities, any differences that you see?
I would argue that differences in racial ideology and organization can structure the ways in which Black folk using Twitter, Black and African folk using Twitter can react to certain Twitter events. So things that are trending in South Africa or Guyana or the UK might not necessarily trend in the United States because the ways in which racial identity is negotiated in those places is different. Bring Back Our Girls trended globally, but different folks reacted to Bring Back Our Girls differently. Does that make sense?
Yep.
More questions? Yes.
I was wondering.
Louder.
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 Can you move the mic?
Just
I'm good. I
speak
can
up.
talk louder. So you talked about your own goal here of highlighting the agency of Black Twitter users. So I was wondering if you could speak more broadly about how we might, as scholars and researchers, think about directions for Black Twitter research across disciplines. If we consider this as a starting point, or however you want to situate the topic.
That's a very interesting question. I don't necessarily see this as directive research for other people to emulate. My political aims, perhaps, but not necessarily my research approach. It's a tough question to answer. I will deploy my standard where I talk about this particular research into race and information technology use as a problematic as opposed to a problem. So I'm not really concerned with the problems of Black Twitter use or racial digital practice. I'm interested in the problematics, the things in which they are responding using digital media to articulate themselves in their everyday struggles, right? And so I therefore do not attempt to solve the problem of racism or incivility or any other things associated with, but I do want to look at the ways in which those things are actualized online. That's the thing I would tell you young whippersnappers as you proceed with your social media research stuff. That's it? Oh, sheesh. So, right. This young gentleman here?
I was curious about, you pointed to the investors' strategic identification with Black Twitter.
I mean,
it seems like Twitter Inc. is a separate beast from Twitter, the cultural phenomenon. And how do you see the institution that manages the infrastructure both like moving closer and building distance from Black Twitter at different points in time?
I don't even know if I would necessarily put that specifically towards Black Twitter. I can think of a number of instances of nascent social media platforms that had to satisfy their investors in terms of their profitability and their sustainability. Tumblr is a really good one, right? Twitter is another one. Facebook has managed to go beyond that, but they saved Instagram from having to go through those same things. So that capitalistic imperative for social media stuff to raise money and be sustainable will always conflict with the users who come to the service to articulate themselves and love themselves. Nancy could probably speak to this more than I could, but the ways in which a lot of the streaming services incorporated Music Brains, which was an open source repository of both lyrics and information about musical styles and aesthetics, and incorporate it and then put it behind a paywall so that you had to pay to use it, right? There will always be that conflict between the organization and the users. I don't know if there's any answer to particularly say that. I think that Chris Sacca is a troublemaker as an activist investor. And although Jack Dorsey wore a Stay Woke shirt to his interview recently on a national stage, that Twitter cannot afford to focus specifically on Black Twitter in order to continue getting money from investors and the like. Does that help? Okay. Mary and then Caroline.
And then we're going to...
Okay. So that I can have...
So I have a question about, thank you for your talk.
Thanks.
I have a question about appropriation.
Mm.
So the commodification of Blackness that might be happening in those moves by Twitter, can you just say something about how that reverberates or how that gets taken up or pushed away by folks who are using it for something that is more personal and direct? So, like, what do we make of that when a company can commodify and appropriate those practices?
I am not an intellectual property researcher. However, I've been aware of intellectual property since Pat Riley tried to trademark the three-peat when the Lakers repeated their, right? And so I am aware that on certain occasions people will attempt to own words in order to profit off their use by other commercial entities. I think it's wrong, right? On the other hand, the West, and America in particular, has a long history of appropriating Black cultural artifacts and aesthetics and claiming them as their own. So there was an article in, I think it was Vogue a few months ago, with Kylie Jenner and her new style of cornrows that nobody had ever heard of, right? Right. And so there's always going to be this tension between things that are practiced by people and ways in which organizations, particularly those driven by a capitalistic imperative, want to try to profit off those. I don't think IHOP should ever have used the term on fleek, but I understand by them using it, it brings to light the ways in which Black people's creativity can inform the ways in which we understand the world. I actually have a dog in this fight because I'm in argument with the Twitterati and the Tumblrati all the time because they feel as if my use of their particular, which is why I have a fake tweet example as opposed to a real one, my use of their content published on Twitter or Tumblr somehow violates their intellectual property. To which I respond, you signed the terms of agreement. Only Tumblr and Twitter owns those words. You don't own them anymore, right? But they find that hard to believe because they did the work. They came up with it. They employed it. Their use of it ended up going viral. And so it's an ongoing conversation. Appropriation is a tough one linguistically. Miley Cyrus, that's a whole other thing. Taylor Swift crawling under women as they twerk, that's a whole other thing. But linguistic appropriation, I'm kind of on the fence about that one. Caroline, and then we're done, right?
Well, then we go outside and have snacks.
Then y'all go
Continue
outside
the
and have snacks.
conversation there.
Okay.
Okay, so I've lost it, but somewhere in the Twitter stream for the hashtag was a comment that San Francisco Twitter in 2008 to 2010 was a very white Twitter, that it was all about coffee and technology.
Like technology. Go ahead.
That's part of the question, right? It's like, how do you parse like a position like that in terms of identifying things like coffee as whiteness, but also like, I don't know. I'd like to hear your response to that because it really contradicts the point that you made. That what did you say? Something like 20% of the users when the service got started were black users.
By 2009, 2007, 2010, different. One of the strengths of the method that I use is that it encourages researchers who are interested in using it to incorporate critical race philosophies and research on the particular groups that they're studying. So I have attempted a couple of times to write about what white internet use looks like. Like Stuff White People Like is a really good example, not only because it's snarky and classist, right, because the guy's an IU grad. Sorry. But it's also in the comments. So I have an article that's still in the, I haven't published it stage, where they talked about Obama as a avatar for white liberalism. And there are, as of today, 19,000 comments for an article that was published in 2008. They add about 800 comments a month. Like the author doesn't pay attention to the page, but people still come back to it. And what they do in those comments is they debate what whiteness means. Right? So my research has always been about finding that point where people start to say, hey, this inflects or impacts my racial identity. Let me talk about it online. And from there, you can start to figure out what white participation in online activities looks like. But it's hard. Whiteness is slippery, right? Intentionally. So if I looked at Jewish Twitter, would that be the same as looking at white Twitter? Maybe, maybe not. What if I'm looking at Ashkenazi or Ethiopian Jews? Then is it still white Twitter? So you have to, as an analyst, you have to be careful and circumscribe the groups that you're looking at, but also be careful to employ information about that cultural group from that cultural group. Does that make sense? Okay, we're done. Thanks. Thank y'all for coming.